Good evening all and welcome. Tonight you are really in for a treat. These stories are so good. You won't be regretting it. Listen to the end because they are so good today. So good. My God. Get ready because it's time to get comfortable and let the glitches take control. I'm going to share with you something that I've carried with me for the last 24 years, and I haven't really spoken much about since I was a child, and I've never spoken about it on any kind of public forum, such as this. You are free to not believe me. I in fact encourage you to doubt anything that you're told from anyone. I am sharing this with you because as I've gotten older, I've spent 2 decades developing a life to the best of my ability. I've carried an immense weight on my shoulders that neither therapists nor psychiatrists treat as anything other than a method of repressing memories at best, and the delusions of a lunatic at worst. I do not blame you if you draw these same conclusions. I'm sharing this with what I believe has become the most publicly traded speaking place on the internet, for the sole purpose of attempting to drop the weight that I've carried with my life. This is more of a personal cleanse than an attempt to intrigue. And if no one hears this and it becomes buried, I would have at least gotten it off my chest. I am not from here, and by here I don't mean where I currently live. I mean where any of us live. Anyone hearing this right now? It's now a few days after my 30th birthday, and this time of year it always strikes me, because I started kindergarten on my birthday when I turned 5. I thought at the time everyone did that. You turned 5, and when you turned 5 you go to school. I didn't realize my birthday just happened to coincide with the first day of school. And a little over 1 year later, in about 2 weeks' time, it would have been 24 years to the day that my entire world vanished. I was born in San Diego and lived in a poorer suburb of San Diego as a child. I lived in an apartment complex called Lemon Vine Apartments that were a bit of a slummier version of the Lemon Vine Apartments found in Lemon Grove, a suburb of San Diego. My parents were divorced but friendly. My mother was young when she had me and she was beautiful. She was in her early 20s and was aspiring to be a model and would regularly take trips to LA to do photo shoots. She did glamour modeling for magazines. She had a darker skin tone, being 1/4 Indian. Indian, not native, and it gave her an exotic look. My favorite picture of her as a child was her modeling a luxurious wedding dress for a bridal company. I used to sleep with that picture when she would go to LA, and I would stay with my dad, who worked for the city of San Diego. They shared custody pretty evenly, and we even did Christmas together as a family, even though they had split when I was still a baby. My dad, his girlfriend, my mum, who was single, and me. Maybe things weren't as good between them as I remember, but I was 6, so if there was drama behind the scenes, they did a good job of hiding it from me. On September 17th, 1996, I was staying at my dad's parents' in Riverside, California. They had a small farm where they raised chickens, pigs, and goats. No horses or sheep or anything, but my grandma had several pet ducks that would eat seeds from your hand, fly away, and return every year like clockwork. My dad had to work at night for a week, and my mum was in LA, so I stayed with my grandparents. Schools back then were pretty cool with this kind of thing, and I was sent home with the sort of nonsense assignment you'd expect a first grader who'd just gone back to school after summer break ended. The 17th was the 3rd day. I was staying with my grandparents, and my grandpa had told me to be careful outside, because he'd seen a rattlesnake and wasn't sure where it had went to. So, since no one knew where the mystery snake had gotten off to, 6-year-old me decided to go hunting for it. In hindsight, letting a 6-year-old go looking around a farm for a rattlesnake was probably not in any parenting 101 handbook, but it was the 90s, and I guess they didn't actually expect me to find it. There were woods on the property, but I wasn't allowed to go in there, so they'd probably figure that's where the snake had gotten off to. I spent all day outside playing jungle exploration on the farm, trying to track down this rattlesnake, and much to my excitement, when I decided to open the well house, which, for those who don't have one, looks kind of like one of the green electrical boxes on the north side of the road, there it was, curled up, rattling away. I immediately slammed the door shut and ran to my grandparents' house to tell them I found it. Now, this might be my 6-year-old memory exaggerating, but I'm pretty sure the snake was 900 feet long at least, give or take. I found it though, and I was excited to tell my grandpa I'd found it so he could do what he did and go out and shoot the thing. I ran in the back door of the house, which led you to the laundry room and through the kitchen. I paid no mind to anything until I turned left and entered the living room, expecting to see my grandparents, my uncle, and the neighboring couple all sat in the living room where I'd left them. Except they weren't there, and it wasn't the same living room anymore. The furniture was completely wrong. The hard and memorable, uncomfortable hardwood furniture my grandpa loved so much was gone. The coffee table he made out of a tree stump was gone, replaced by a fluffy grandma-looking furniture. A 3-person sofa with a floral design on it. The TV was in the wrong place, and newer than Grandpa's old, sit-on-the-ground cabinet TV. The hardwood paneling on the walls was gone, or at least covered by blue wallpaper. The hardwood floor was a shaggy off-white carpet. The pictures of my dad, my uncle and me and my grandparents were gone from the walls, replaced by paintings and pictures of people I didn't know. As confused as I was by this, I was more confused by everyone being missing. In my 6-year-old brain, I accepted that they may have completely rearranged the house while I'd spent the day looking for a snake, but I didn't believe at all that they'd just leave me alone. And I didn't see anyone leave. I didn't see the cars go. So I walked out the front door, which was attached to the living room, as they usually are, and thought maybe they'd gone to the chickens or pigs, both of which should have been visible from the front porch. But the chicken coop was gone. The pig pen had lost its fencing and there were no pigs to be found. At this point I was beyond confused, and I was getting very scared. I didn't want to be alone. I didn't see anyone. Even though they lived on a small farm, the neighbors that had been visiting lived just across the dirt road. So I ran down our dirt driveway and across the road to their house, assuming that it must have been where they went. I remember getting more and more scared as I ran to their house and started crying when their house was the wrong color. It wasn't the faded yellow house it used to be. It wasn't even the right house anymore. Nevertheless, I banged on the door. I remember at this point I was crying quite profusely because I didn't understand what was happening, and I kept wiping my face, which covered it in dirt after having been digged around under stumps and logs for snakes all day. When the door opened, a woman in her late 40s to early 50s answered, and I'd never seen her before. I just started bawling uncontrollably. Everything after this point is largely a blur, because nothing was right. I knew where I lived, I knew where I went to school, I knew where my grandparents lived, but I met the people who lived there where my grandparents lived, and they were not my grandparents. I did not know them. I begged for them to get my uncle and tell him who I was, but my uncle wasn't there. Through a series of various police and people in suits, I was brought back to the town in which I lived, after spending what seemed like 10 hours in the local police station trying to contact my parents. I had my home phone number memorized, but told them my dad would be asleep. But when they called that number, the person on the other end had no idea who I was, or what they were talking about. I was asked to give the police officers my address, and sat in the local police station while the police in my hometown went to my address. When they finally called the station back, they were informed that the name of the apartment building was incorrect. Lemon Vine Apartments didn't exist, and the address I gave to them was an apartment complex called Merritt Manor, and the apartment number I gave them was unoccupied. I believe at this point, They were operating under the assumption that I had given them the wrong name of the apartment and the wrong apartment number, but I did in fact live there. When I was finally brought to my hometown after changing hands a few times between police, I was asked to give the police officers my addresses again, and was driven to where I lived. That was it. That was my apartment complex, but just like everything else, it looked wrong. It was painted a different color, and the sign that used to have a large image of a lemon reading lemon vine now read Merritt Manor. I took the police to exactly where I lived, and they said, no one lives there. From this point forward, the police attempted to contact neighbors, all of whom knew me. None of them were who they were supposed to be. Every person who came out of the apartment building around me were the wrong people, and they didn't know me. From this point, they attempted to contact my father, which should have been easy as he worked for the city. But no employee by his name apparently worked for the city in any capacity. As day turned to night, I spent endless hours sitting in the police station as they attempted to find any person in the world who knew me. I couldn't do anything but cry and cry and cry endlessly. A woman in a suit who I think was either a detective or just someone who happened to work at the station sat with me for several hours and tried to keep me calm. She gave me a stuffed dog, a Dalmatian puppy, that looked a bit like one of the dogs from 101 Dalmatians, and told me his name was Sparky. She said I could keep Sparky, and that when they found my parents, Sparky would go home with me and make sure I didn't get lost again. She said he was a good dog, and he'd protect me, if I took care of him. During this time, they attempted my school. I told them I went to Shawnee Elementary. It was easy to find. It was really close to where I lived. But a school by such a name, as you guessed it, did not exist. My school was now apparently called Anza Elementary. At one point, I was asked if the police had ever taken my fingerprint, and they had. In kindergarten, my entire class had our fingerprints taken by the police at the school gym, for basically this exact reason. Unsurprisingly, this didn't help at all. They couldn't find my parents, my grandparents, my neighbors, my apartment, or even me. They couldn't find me. I was too young to remember what my social security number was, but I severely doubt it mattered. They asked my birthday, any relevant information that could help them figure out who I was and where I belonged, but nothing I told them turned up any information about me. At some point during the day, I was briefly taken to the ER, as police suspected I may have sustained some kind of head injury. After being looked over by a doctor, they found nothing wrong with me, and I was sent back to the police station. I ended up staying with someone that night. I'm not entirely sure who it was. Someone from child services, I imagine. I couldn't stop crying long enough to really focus on what was happening at this point. I cried myself to sleep several times in the police station and cried myself to sleep again at the house I stayed in at the night. Despite the woman who I was staying with, not the same one who gave me Sparky, doing everything in her power to calm me down. I clung to Sparky so hard I'm surprised I never popped his head off. I didn't have a picture of my mum. I didn't know what was going on, and no one could find out where I belonged. This didn't make sense to me. I was only 6, just barely. I lived where I lived, and my parents were my parents, and my school was my school. They didn't just all disappear in one day. In between fits of crying and waking up, I begged to just go home. I begged for the lady that I was staying with to try and call my dad again. I just kept begging to go home. Over the next few days, I was interrogated and questioned by different people at different times, at different places, at all hours of the day. Police, investigators, people from departments I still don't know, child psychologists, everyone under the sun was asking me questions. I was back and forth between the police station, the house I was staying at, until eventually someone told me that they thought they'd located my parents, and they were coming to get me. Finally, I was going home. Finally, this was over. Finally, I could get away from all these strange people asking me the same question over and over. When the couple showed up at the police station, my heart fell into my feet. They weren't my parents, but they'd had a son that had gone missing and I fit his description pretty close. The woman started crying when she saw me, because she immediately knew I wasn't her missing son. But I was out of tears to cry at this point. Eventually I was collected by child services, and I was taken to a foster family where I stayed for a few months. The police launched a campaign asking for anyone to come forward with information about me. They took my picture at the police station for the newspapers to put in the news. I never let go of Sparky for a second. They didn't want me to hold him in the photo because I didn't have him when I arrived. But I needed him, and I would throw an immense tantrum when someone tried to take him away. They had put me back on the clothes I was wearing when they found me, but they'd since given me new clothes to wear. In those months I spent at the foster home, parents of missing children would come to the houses to see if I was their child. I didn't realize this was what was happening until I was older, and looked back on it. They didn't just pull me out and say, "Is this your kid?" They were a bit more subtle about it. The parents would come to meet me, and upon realizing I wasn't their missing child, they'd often leave in tears. Looking back at all these families that came to see me in desperation that they were going to have their child back, I felt so horrible for them. It's a feeling I can't really explain. Like a type of guilt. Like I wish I had been their child, so they could have taken me back. And now, they were safe. Most of those people probably never saw their children again, but I try and imagine that all of them were reunited, even though I know that isn't likely. The guilt was one of the things that kept me in therapy as an adult. But like I said, no therapist has ever bought my story or believed me. The most common belief suggested to me has been that I was abandoned as a child and lived in an abusive home, dumped on the side of a dirt road in the middle of farmland, and I repressed all the negative memories I had of my past. I didn't stay in that foster home permanently. Eventually, while my case wasn't officially closed, I needed to start going to school. I needed identification, and I was issued a birth certificate for the date that I told them was my birth year. But the day and month were listed as September 17th, the day I was found. I never understood why they didn't just use the day and month of my actual birth, but I imagine it's because they didn't think I knew what it was. My name was unchanged. I started going to school sporadically. One of the child psychologists who had seen me recommended I not be placed back into full curriculum immediately, and suspected I suffered some form of PTSD. I was put in special classes, and was only made to go to school twice a week initially. Eventually, I started going full-time and changed foster homes a few more times. I really can't say how much time passed before it happened, but eventually I was placed up for adoption. I was never actually told I was up for adoption, so I'm not sure how soon after I was found. But eventually people started coming to meet me. But these people weren't looking for a missing child. They were looking to adopt me. But I definitely did not represent myself as a good candidate. I had a story that no one believed or could verify. I insisted my parents would eventually find me, and I rarely had a day that I wasn't crying until my eyes burned. This story does not have a happy ending. I never saw my parents again, and I was a ward of the state until I was 18, and went nowhere from there. My teens were filled with delinquency, and I did a brief stint in something similar to juvie in San Diego called Chaparral. I never went to college, never really started getting my life together until I was around 24. I haven't spoken publicly about this before now, not at least since I was a child speaking to everyone who was trying to figure out where I came from. I still have Sparky. He's old, he's worn, still in one piece, no longer white, he's now a dark shade of grey. He sits on my dresser and is there, just like he's always been, as long as I've been here. I've also been asked a handful of questions, which I think I will address now. The first question is, what things are different in places you came from compared to where you are now? To answer, I'm not really sure. I've been asked about countries, states, laws, planets, languages, you name it. The fact is I don't really know. I was 6. The continents could have been completely different and I would have had no idea. I wasn't particularly bright either. I mean, I was hunting for rattlesnakes. I also thought California was a country. I can say the President of the United States was not Bill Clinton. I can't remember exactly what his name was, but we had to learn it in kindergarten. I think his name might have been Robert or something. I want to say Robert Wilmer, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, that's my story. I doubt anyone will hear this, and it's likely to be buried within 15 minutes. But it's now off my chest and in the open, and hopefully I can go to sleep with a little bit more weight off. When I was a kid, my family planned a trip to New York. We were going to take the train all the way to New York from Oklahoma. At the time, the nearest train station was in Kansas, so we had to drive there first. We left our house in the early morning with plenty of time to make our train, which left at 9 or 10 at night. After driving all day, we made it to Kansas, but somehow got completely and hopelessly lost looking for the train station. For hours we drove on empty country roads that seemed endless. This was the 90s, and well before GPS or the average person having cell phones. All we had was a useless map, and when I say these roads were empty, I mean there was nothing. No gas station, no houses, no stores, just absolutely endless grassland as far as the eye could see. It was night now and pitch black due to the lack of street lamps, other cars, or buildings. The whole area seemed completely dead and abandoned. Finally, with about 20 minutes to spare before our train left, we stumbled across an old building with a payphone inside. The building was run down and looked like it had been abandoned, but may have been a gas station at one point. My mum got out the car and called the cops for help. By now, all of us kids were crying and freaking out, afraid we would miss our train. We had never been on a train before, and we had been so excited about this trip for months. My dad was in a horrid mood, because we had driven all day long to make it on time, and we should have arrived at the station hours ago. Now we only had minutes to get help and find the station. It seemed absolutely hopeless that we would make it there on time. There was no one around, and we knew it would take the police forever to get to us, here in the middle of nowhere. That's when things got weird. My mum hung up the phone and came back to the car, and the second she got in and closed the door, a cop pulled up out of nowhere. I'm telling you, there was nothing on this road for miles and miles. There was no possible way for the police, on the phone, to have sent someone in the time it took for my mum to hang up and walk a few feet back to our car. Even if the cop had been in the area, it would have still taken a few minutes for him to get the call on his radio. I'm telling you that only seconds had passed from the moment she hung up the phone. But the cop knew all about us. He knew we'd called, that we were lost and looking for the station. He was incredibly nice and told us to follow him, and also that if we did the speed limit, we wouldn't make it. I remember that distinctly because it was not something a cop would normally say. He didn't seem like an ordinary cop at all. He seemed to know everything about our situation, almost as if he knew us personally. We followed the cop out of the deserted parking lot, and within seconds were in the train station. It seemed to appear out the darkness like a mirage. There had not been any signs pointing to it, and there was absolutely nothing else around. We made it to the train with about 10 minutes to spare, waiting for it. To this day, we still talk about it as a family, and wonder how it was possible for the cops to have gotten to us that fast on a dark, deserted country road with nothing around for miles. We also have no idea how we were so close to the train station. My mum thinks the cop was an angel, and I don't know what to think. It was one of the weirdest things I have ever experienced, and to this day I can't explain what happened, or who that cop was, or how we got to the station that night. I used to work in music and toured with this band. The guitarist, called Josh, of the band, had a best friend called Matt who died a few years back. He always talked about the kid and seemed like a great guy. Josh always had this reoccurring dream where Matt was standing on this abandoned street, which supposedly was metaphorical for purgatory. Josh had all these conversations with Matt in these dreams, and because he had overdosed unexpectedly, he felt like his spirit was not able to move on. At the end of the dream, Matt would take a bulb from the street light on the street they were standing in the middle of. Josh described these dreams in extreme detail, and I could pretty much picture what the street looked like. Fast forward to about 6 months into touring with these guys. They are huge Bright Eyes fans and wanted to stop in Cassadaga, Florida, as the Bright Eyes singer wrote an album there, and it's a really creepy and spiritual place. It might be worth noting that 6 out of 7 of the people I was with are all atheists. So we drive into Cassadaga about 2 or 3 a.m. and drive around. Suddenly, this black dog comes into the middle of the road and just stops and looks at us. The guy in the band were all weirded out and were just saying things like, "Follow the dog, it's trying to show us something." And in my mind, I'm thinking, these guys are idiots. We follow the dog for a few blocks, and it was just walking pretty slowly. All of a sudden, we turn a street and the dog bolts. We try to speed up, but Josh says, "Stop the van. This is it." We're all confused. He gets out of the van and looks around. This is it. This is the street in my dream. We hang out for about 15 minutes, and the way he described the street, from having houses on the left to a park on the right, it was definitely a street. The one from the dream. As we get in the van, a street light goes off and we just drive off. He claimed he never had any more dreams about it, and it was closure on everything. I'm not a superstitious or generally spiritual person, but in high school, I was in the drum line, and we practiced early in the morning prior to starting school. We were inside the band room that day because it was fairly cold. So anyway, I'm doing my thing playing the tenors, and I drop one of my mallets. I turn to pick it up and can't find it. There is about 10 feet of open bare floor surrounding me, and it's nowhere to be found. My instructor stops us and basically just asks me what the problem is. So several of us start searching around but can't find it. I say screw it, grab my spare set, and about 20 minutes later the band director walks in, unlocks his office, sits on his desk, and knocks on the window. I look up, and he picks up the mallet from his desk with a look like, "What is this doing here?" I could verify that it was mine because I marked each set. Nobody had gone in or out. There's no gap under the door, it's a locked room, and it somehow ended up on the desk? There were 15 of us in that room at the time, and there was a unanimous nope at that moment. I was stunned, and one of my buddies became unglued. We pretty much cancelled the rest of the rehearsal right there and then, and many of us were pretty bugged out about the rest of the day. I couldn't concentrate on anything for almost a week after that. Eventually my brain just filed it away under unsolved mysteries, and we ended up carrying on with life. I was a sophomore in high school, at my girlfriend's house watching a movie. It was around 10 p.m. when the flick ended, and I proceeded to skateboard home, as I only lived 2 blocks away and it was a pretty quiet suburban neighborhood. I'm skating down the hill towards a larger street, larger but never really busy, especially not at night. When I reached the intersection, I nail a rock. I had planned on blasting across the street since there were no cars coming in either direction. I fly off the board, skid a good 3 to 4 feet on my head, right shoulder, hip and knee. I rolled to my back and screamed out in agony. The pain was so bad I couldn't really move. I looked up the road about 30 yards off, and a car is coming straight down the way. And where I landed, I was right in its path, 2-lane street. I was right in the middle of his lane, my head aligned with the wheel. I tried like hell to move and scream but couldn't do anything. The car was 15 yards off. He didn't see me, made no attempt to swerve. 10 yards. I heard him barreling down and I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. Nothing. I opened my eyes, looked where the car had been. Nothing. Hear the car behind me. Look where it was supposed to be in the other direction. Tail lights cruising up the road. I hadn't moved. He hadn't swerved. It was like he passed through me. Or I passed through him. There isn't really any way he could have passed over me. Not with the way I had landed, and I was positioned in the street. It was a little car. I can't explain it. I got up terrified, bloodied and baffled, hobbled home, and went to sleep. No one believed me, but it's true. I remember being pretty young, like 9 or 10, and I was in the car park of a pub in England, Southend, and remember seeing someone in their teens in the window of a house looking over the car park. They waved at me and I felt like I knew them somehow. My parents asked me who I was waving to and I just said some lady in the window over there. Didn't think much of it. Fast forward 10 years, I was at my grandma's house. I remember walking into her room, which I was never allowed to do, and going to the window. I then realized I was in the house looking over that same parking lot and remembering their interaction years before. Then a girl around 9 or 10 who was in said car park waved at me and I waved back, and I felt like I knew her. Could not explain it, and I've never told it to anyone, but it still freaks me out. I had a friend in high school called Bob. He was very nice, and while we weren't that close, we had similar tastes in music and we shared CDs. This was in the late 80s and way before file sharing. We eventually graduated and I moved several hundreds of miles away to college and we lost touch. When I left for college, I had one of Bob's CDs still in my possession, Beat by King Crimson. Fast forward 10 years and I graduated college and was knee-deep in my career and finally saved up enough money and bought my first house. In the new house, while I was unpacking, I see the CD in the box. I hadn't noticed it in many years and thought, gee, I really should track down Bob and return this. Then, at that moment, the doorbell rings. It's Bob, and he says, hey, you wouldn't happen to still have my King Crimson CD, would you? I'm looking down and I'm holding it in my hand. I hand it to him, and his mouth drops open. Mine probably already is. We exchange pleasantries. I ask him how he found me, but can't remember his answer anymore, and he eventually takes off. Haven't seen Bob since. This happened to me in 3rd grade, and it scared me so much I started crying and had to go to the office to talk to the principal about it. I was in the hallway for misbehaving, and my neighbor Tad, a year younger than me, came out of class to my right, passed in front of me and headed down some stairs. We said hi to each other, and about 20 seconds later, he walked out of the same class, passed in front of me, and headed down the stairs. I just stared at him, confused and afraid, and he looked back like, why the hell are you looking at me like that? I never realized how much of a Matrix deja vu it was. I've also got a second example of this. A few years after this incident, my sister and I were hanging in the living room watching TV. We both saw our mum walk through the other room and through the adjacent hall. 20 minutes later, she came in from the backyard. My sister and I looked at each other confused and asked how she got back outside. She didn't know what we were talking about. She'd been outside for hours. No one else was home, of course. I died. I saw it. I lived it. Either it was on another world with a version of me that died, or I'm going crazy, but I died. We had a prep rally in school, and after it was finished, we had to go back to class. Well, my friend and I were not in that, so we wanted to go across the street to Sonic. Across the street, there is not heavy traffic, but if you don't pay attention, you can get hit. Well, I remember walking with him and he dropped something, so I went across the street first. I just saw a red Tahoo heading right at me and I got hit. I remember everything, gasping for air, waking up, and sleeping again. Then nothing. All of a sudden I was back in this stadium again, and the exact same words came out of my principal's mouth. My friend wanted to go get Sonic, but I was freaking out and was asking him everything. I thought it had to just been a dream. But when I went with him to see what would happen, he dropped his stuff again and I waited. To my horror, the same red Tahooey shows up, and I told him that I'm going back to school, not dying again. I can still see the other version of me on that street just messed up, not even moving. At 12 years of age, my mum let me stay in the truck as she went grocery shopping. As I wait, I see an old guy walking towards the truck with an indescribable look at me, as if I know too much. He stops 5 feet from the truck, looks at me for a few seconds and heads back to the exact way he came. It was rather traumatic for some reason and very confusing at that age. 5 or 6 years later, my dad was showing me some home videos of us at Yellowstone. At Old Faithful, I noticed the same guy, same look, same clothes, peering at us on camera and at me through the TV. I freak out every time I tell this. One time, my wife and I were coming back from a dinner night out. When I opened the door of the house, she was sitting at the computer working, as I usually find her when I get home. Nothing unusual, except she was entering the house with me. I shrugged it off and carried on. We went to bed and I told her that I saw her sitting at the computer, and she goes dead serious and told me that when I opened the door, she saw herself sitting at the computer working. Creepiest thing I've ever experienced. The fact that our neighbor's 2-year-old daughter used to point to the TV when it was off and tell us the person on the screen was making scary faces and that she wanted it to go away didn't help us sleep much that night. My girlfriend is a manager where she works, and since the pandemic has affected everything, she's been working from home. She can't afford to be away from her computer for any length of time, so I pick up the slack by working around the house and running errands. Errands were the order of the day, and I needed to go to our big local big box wholesale store to pick up some things, then the hardware store, and finally the supermarket for some dinner items. The trip to the wholesale store took longer than expected due to roadway construction, and I was very frustrated and angry by the time I made it to the street and was en route to my final stop. Traffic from that point on was moderate, but I was still annoyed from the earlier mess and drove more aggressively than I should have. Finally, I made it to the supermarket where I collected the needed items, but when I tried to go through one of the self-checkout stations, the damn thing kept messing up, and my earlier frustration was redoubled, as it was all I could do to not scream profanities at the thing. But I managed to get my items and get back out to my vehicle. I sat there for a moment, letting the air conditioning cool me off as it had been quite warm outside. I was still aggravated and frustrated by the entire experience. So, I tried to calm down and scrolled through my phone to get my mind focused. As I stared casually at the screen out of my left peripheral vision, I saw a woman walk towards the store entrance. She was wearing a light 3/4 sleeve shirt, greyish coloured shorts, and a black piping. Her hair was pulled up in a bun on the back of her head, and she wore large brown sunglasses, which she was adjusting with her right hand. I watched her for a moment as she headed into the store. Now, I don't know if my earlier heightened emotional state had anything to do with this, but not more than 1 minute later, the exact same woman walked past me in front of me again. Now, let me be clear, this wasn't another person who looked like this woman, not a twin, nor had the woman returned to her vehicle without me seeing her. This was not déjà vu. This was the same woman, same clothes, same hair, and sunglasses that she adjusted with her right hand in exactly the same manner as before. My jaw hung slack as I witnessed this. I couldn't make sense of it. I have never had anything like this happen to me. I was totally freaked out. I thought about going back to the store to try and confirm what I'd seen, but I knew that I was not seeing things, and that this actually happened. Ultimately, I elected to just go home. Sometimes I wonder if the Matrix really exists. Ever since I was a kid, I have what I call doubling occasionally happen around me. I put something in my pocket and then find it in another pocket, as well as in the original pocket I had it in. And yes, it's happened with money before. The most standout example was when I was a teen at camp. All the leaders had engraved plastic name tags, and we were all issued only one. I used to keep mine between my hat and my shirt. At the end of camp, I just crammed all my stuff in a duffel and headed home. Later, when I unpacked, the first thing I do is pull out my hat with my tag in it. And of course, a minute later I pull out a shirt with the same name tag pinned to it. I also have experienced a similar phenomenon where I was a kid. For a few years it happened on a daily basis, but I haven't seen it much in a long time. Someone would place something in their pocket or backpack, but when they went to grab it, it would later be missing. I would then reach into my pocket or backpack and pull it out. I initially got accused of being a thief, but when it happened repeatedly, when I hadn't even been within 20 feet of the victim, my friends and classmates stopped doing it. So they just kind of accepted that it would happen around me. Moral of the story? I'm a quantum counterfeit and pickpocket. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I told you these would be good. I told you. And they were. I delivered. Wow. I'm impressed. I really liked all these stories. They're so creepy. The first story had my mind like, whoa, I don't even know. I have a theory. Pretty wild, but I'm going to just throw it out there. It's a theory after all. It doesn't have to make very much sense. But what if the snake bit the kid and he died, but then somehow his mind, I don't know, just went to another plane of existence? Who knows? It's such a weird story and I love it. I love weird stories like this. Good glitch in the Matrix stories are hard to come by, which is why we hardly ever do them. But this story was seriously good. Seriously good. And so were the rest of them. I love them all. I hope you did too. Because, yeah, you know, it's Halloween. We're getting up to creepy day. So yeah, I think this was definitely a good one to throw into the mix. Really great stories. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you weren't disappointed because, well, I love them. Also, thank you to all my wonderful patrons and members whose names are on screen. You can have your name immortalized forever on a video. All you have to do is sign up. For a small amount of money every month, you can have your name on screen and some cool other perks if you so wish. But for now, I think I'm going to leave it there. Your minds must be sufficiently boggled. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.